Jorge María Londoño, and I am one of TGEU's two co-chairs. I would like to start by welcoming you to this conversation. We will soon dive right into it. I can't wait to get started. But first, also just wanted to say a quick...
Хотелось также...
We are a transnational or international trans organization advocating for trans rights. We organize trans activists and trans organizations across Europe and Central Asia. And some of the voices that we organize will be here today to speak about this topic. We did have some problems with the streaming service. It seems like we are all now causing it up on Zoom and we couldn't get it on our social media, but that's fine. I mean, this is a place where we all feel comfortable. We've been hanging out in these virtual rooms. I don't know how long now. Quick reminder though, is that we are recording this conversation. And if you feel like you don't wanna be on tape, to turn off your camera and microphone and you won't be recorded. Yes, okay, let's get started and then maybe also present what we're going to talk about. So today is March 9th, the day after International Women's Day. I hope you had an amazing day yesterday. We wanted to have this conversation on March 8th, but chose to have it on March 9th. And the reason why is because March 8th is also a holiday in Berlin. So we're going to talk about how we can build trans feminist movements together. And the outline for this is that trans-exclusionary discourses within some feminist groups have been growing, not only in Europe, but across the world the past few years. And this conversation is having a quite strong impact on trans rights and the health also for trans people and security. And this narrative falsely, I would say, places trans rights as a threat or a competition to women's rights and tries to place feminist and trans movements against each other. And on this occasion, the day after International Women's Day, we would like to welcome you to this conversation about how we can create an inclusive alternative to this feminism, how we can create our own intersectional space, and also how we build bridges and try to solve this problem and come over this hurt that we're in right now. We also want to address members of the trans community and also potential allies, because we think that this is a fight that we have to do together. So I would like to start by welcoming the panelists for today, or the people that I will have an easy and easygoing conversation with. First, I would like to welcome Ksenija, which is, Ksenija, you are with us from Italy, and you are not only a previous IGLYO chair, you are also an author and researcher of resilience of trans and non-binary social activists. And I'm not gonna get into much into your presentation, but I would like to welcome you to this conversation and maybe present yourself.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here with you today and to discuss this topic. I am joining you from Italy, yes, and I apologize for wearing a mask, but I'm at the university office and this is a requirement. So I'm Ksen, I am a queer activist originally from Serbia, where I did queer activism with the youth organization. And also I was working with IGLYO for quite some time as a member of the executive board and a co-chair later. But now I'm doing my research, my PhD research on experiences of resilience of trans and non-binary social justice activists who are working specifically within LGBTQ organizations or trans-specific organizations. So I'm really happy to be here with you today.
Thank you. It's completely fine that you have a mask. We hear you perfectly. And we did some jokes also before starting this live about, you know, not catching your computer's viruses and also not transmitting. Very much welcome. Sabrina, welcome to you as well. You are not only a trans activist, but you're also a co-chair of the ICRSE board. And of course, advocate for the rights of sex workers amongst many, but you're also engaged in TGEU and our organizations. I would love to welcome you to this conversation and also to present yourself.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jorge Maria. And thank you for having me in this panel. It's such a pleasure always to be in any transgender Europe event. I've participated in 2 councils, and it's always been a great experience with sharing experiences and knowledge with trans people from the whole Europe. And it's yeah, I think this topic it's very important, as we will talk later. In Spain, it's a whole topic nowadays. Not yesterday, on Sunday, it came like the demonstration, like the fascism. It's inside feminism. There are those fascists in purple. But yeah, it's very important that we also have our alliances in the diverse feminisms, and they support us. So thank you very much for having this conversation, and back to you. Thank you.
Yes, and we're also very pleased to have you here, because we will talk a little bit about what's happening in Spain, which is also happening in other places in Europe, but then the legislation part of this conflict. And then finally, our third panelist, Ugla, Stefanía, Kristjönudóttir, Jónsdóttir. Really hard to practice on that. You're the president of Trans Iceland, and you're engaged in both the trans community and trans activism in the United Kingdom and on Iceland as well. Please do tell some more about yourself and why you're here.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here, and you pronounced my name pretty well, actually, so I'm quite impressed by that. But yeah, I do a lot of trans activism, and I've done for a very long time. And I've, as you said, I'm the current chair of Trans Iceland. I've also worked with IGLYO, with Ksenija, actually, at one point. So I've worked on a lot of different things all over Europe, really. And I've worked with TGEU briefly as well. And I'm currently in Iceland, so I'm calling from Iceland, but I also live part-time in the UK, where I do a lot of activism. And it's quite interesting to see the difference between trans activism in Iceland and the UK. And that's sort of what I guess I want to talk about and bring up in the chat. So I'm really looking forward to chatting with everyone and hearing what everybody has to say.
Very interesting, and very much welcome here. And it's such a pleasure also to have that perspective from 2 different previous member states, or whatever you can call the UK now, in the Council of Europe and other transnational organizations. So maybe just let's get and dive right straight to it, Ugla. Maybe just by asking you if you can help us set the stage and understand this problem. What are we actually talking about here? What is trans feminism, first of all? How does trans feminism differ from regular feminism, or whatever regular feminism is? And how can feminism be trans-exclusionary or trans-hating? And also, why are we seeing these trans-hating women groups across Europe? Where would you start?
Yeah, it's a good question. Where to start? I mean, there's so many things which you can say about it, but I guess if we just sort of start with the beginning of it, I mean, trans feminism sort of is what it says. You know, it's feminism that's inclusive of trans people and is inclusive of gender identity, gender expression, and that this is very diverse. And to me, that's just what feminism should be in reality, because that's always what feminism has been about. It's about breaking away from gender expectations, gender norms, that our bodies don't define who we are. And that's always been a feminist slogan. I mean, ever since the 70s, you know, feminists in the 70s were writing under banners of biology is not destiny. So there's nothing new about feminism being trans-inclusive and trans people belonging to feminism, because they always have, and we've been here for a very long time. So to me, that is essentially, trans-feminism is essentially what feminism should be. But I guess in more specific terms, it is feminism that like explicitly goes into trans issues as well. So it's kind of like a subcategory of feminism, I suppose, because there's lots of different types of feminism, and trans-feminism is one of those. But what also happens is that it kind of creates there's the opposite of that, which is usually called trans-exclusionary radical feminism. And that is when feminists or people who sort of start to exclude trans people and sort of really, it's really hard for me to call it feminism really, because it goes so fundamentally against everything that feminism is to me, because feminism is against fundamentalism, it's against biological determinism, but that's essentially what trans-exclusionary radical feminism does. And going to the UK and starting to live there in 2016, I've sort of started to realize that the UK is a big hub of this sort of anti-trans rhetoric that we're seeing. And a lot of people here in the UK sort of joke that the Britain is turf island, as they call it, which I find quite interesting. And it's sort of like most of these arguments and all of these things which you see popping up in different countries around Europe usually can be traced back to the UK in many ways. And that's a really, really interesting thing. And I don't quite know why, and I can't quite explain to you why this has sort of happened in the UK, but I think
Получилось в Великобритании, но
history of treating LGBT people quite badly. Up until 2003, it was illegal to talk about being queer in schools in the UK. So they have a long history of sort of, you know, not wanting to have conversations about diversity, and racism and fascism is a constant struggle in the UK, I think. So it sort of doesn't surprise me that this also rises in the UK, because the media in the UK is particularly vile and particularly hostile. And trans people, as we all know, are often scapegoated for other issues. And in the UK, trans people seem to have become the scapegoat for a lot of issues. And it's actually quite interesting when you start looking into the history of when words such as gender critical or sex-based rights started to rise on social media in particular. And if you sort of dive into it on social media, it didn't start until about 2015 that people started using these phrases as a form of an identity, or as a form of a fight to fight for a cause. And you can actually trace it to a place called 4chan, which I'm sure everybody knows, but this is a place where they started organizing, where there's groups of people saying, wouldn't it be, you know, how can we pit feminists and trans people against each other? And that's essentially a conversation that's being had on these sort of alt-right fascist websites. And since this conversation happened, it's really taken off. So to me, you know, this is basically the alt-right or fascism trying to pit vulnerable groups against each other, because essentially, of course, feminists and trans people and queer people in general should be fighting for the same cause. And to me, it just seems really, really bizarre to see how it's sort of been twisted into something it's not, and it's been completely turned around. And it's really, really hard to sort of try and fight against it, because all of these arguments and this rhetoric is so based in primal fears, and it's based on these things which really gets people concerned. And the way they phrase things is very emotive. They always try to get people to realize there's a threat going on, there's a threat to people's safety. And when you're up against that, it's really hard to correct it, because if someone throws something out often enough, it sort of becomes the truth to people and they start to believe it. And trying to take that away and tell people it's not true is so much more difficult than it is to than it is to throw this sort of propaganda around. And that's the nature of propaganda, really. You know, it's so much more harder to refute it than it is to establish it. And that's sort of what has happened a lot in the UK. And this is something that you can see in the media in the UK every single day. There's an anti-trans something, and it's just, it doesn't matter what it is. Everything gets turned into trans people, even when things have nothing to do with trans people. And it's really, really disheartening to see, and it's hard to know how to do it. But then there are countries that are doing much better about this than the UK. For example, Iceland, where I'm from, the feminists, or the main women's rights association, works really closely with Trans-Iceland. And Trans-Iceland has become a membership organization of them. So it's, you know, there are countries where they are fighting it. And in Iceland, there are, of course, these rhetorics and these arguments are starting to rise, but we've sort of started to do the groundwork to prevent it from becoming as big of a problem. But we are fortunate in the aspect that we are only 320,000 people in a very small country. We don't have a very, we don't have a history of strong religion or any sort of forces that might be more conservative. So it's easier for us, I think, in many ways to combat it. But I think there's still something to be learned from countries and places that have managed to sort of start laying the groundwork before it started to rise. So yeah, I guess that's my first thoughts.
Your first take on it.
Yeah.
Things I want to comment one thing, and then I think we should get on to as exactly like maybe the core of this problem, which is this biological determinism, which it all ends up to. You mentioned fascism, and I'm thinking about, you know, what it's like to be fighting against police in late 60s. You know, I'm thinking about Stonewall Inn and New York City and these areas which were safe spaces for many queer people and even trans people before that word or those terms even existed, and how we are seeing a result now where queer people or trans people have rights, some rights. So that means that the police won't just barge into a bar and ruin the place. I mean, that could still happen, but we have somewhat of a protection now. But now we're seeing like individuals that are policing gender, in a sense that, you know, they would tell you if they feel like you're in the wrong bathroom or anything like that. And it's really, I think it's mind-boggling how, you know, these people who were trans feminists before the term even existed or even needed to exist, did fight against fascism in that sense. And now it's like on a peer-to-peer level or a person-to-person. So maybe let's enter this question of determinism, because we know that trans-hating women groups focus a lot on biology, and I would say sometimes also could be obsessed with genitalia. They sometimes see biology as the sole determinant factor of sex or their perception of sex. But we of course know that sex, gender identity, and gender expression is way much more complex than that. How would you say, Ugla, that we can understand this divide, first of all, in how we define a problem, or in this case, how we define our bodies, and how can we help overcome this misconception of biology and science, which are often thrown at us when actually biology and science is just telling trans people, you know, it seems like you exist. It seems like you were right this whole time.
Yeah, I mean, and that's sort of exactly it. I mean, when people throw science and they say, well, this is science, it's well, actually the science says we're here and we're real and this is what it is. So actually the science is on our side. But it's really interesting it's a really interesting question about how to combat it, because yes, as you said, it's all about biology. It's always about what genitalia people have. I mean, the only people I see talk about trans people's genitalia more than trans people themselves are them, you know. So it's like they have constant conversations about it. So it is an obsession, I think, and it's really hard to, I wish I had the answers on how to refute it or how to tell people how to make it stop. But I think, you know, in my experience, what's worked a lot in the UK and sort of combating this is not getting bogged into these conversations, especially on social media and things where people are never ever gonna change their mind or do anything. And I think it's about showing diverse trans people living their lives and living their truths and doing their thing is a really, really powerful thing. And I think that's what, you know, we need to start doing more of, elevating our voices, elevating our stories, because it's obvious that social media and the media isn't always going to do that. So we're just going to have to keep pushing and telling our stories, because no one really cares about, you know, it's like the whole conversation about biology and what's in your, you know, it becomes so, it's become so far removed from our lived realities, right? Because that's not what trans people are necessarily about. Of course, it matters to us. And of course, it's important that we get the healthcare we need, but trans people are always so much more than that. And we want to, you know, fight for different things. So I think in my experience, when they get into this biological determinism and they say, well, you know, you have these chromosomes or these genitals or this type of body, and that means you're this and this and that, pointing out the opposite is often quite effective. So when they say, well, you know, trans women are likely to come into this space and assault women, and well, actually, if you look at research, it shows that trans women and trans feminine people are disproportionately affected by male violence, for example, and they are, you know, people who use shelters, people who need places to go to. And, you know, when you point out those hard facts, it is quite obvious, but it's also difficult because when they use such emotive arguments, using facts doesn't always work against it. So it's really difficult to find what sort of message is the most impactful, because even if it's completely true, people aren't going to listen necessarily to statistics or facts when someone's using a really emotive and a fearful argument. So you kind of have to be able to lead with something else rather than the facts. And you have to lead with something that brings people together, some sort of common value or common ground in which we can all relate to. So saying things like, well, everybody deserves to feel safe when they enter a space, and everybody deserves to feel supported in whatever they do. And this is something people can't really disagree with. So if you sort of establish yourself as the reasonable person and you say all these things which people can relate to, they will often quite quickly unravel themselves as quite hostile and quite toxic. And that's sort of the tactic I've been using, is never directly engage with their arguments, because if you're just constantly reacting, you are never creating the conversation and you're never creating the frame in which you want to have the conversation. So it's about taking the framing back and not reacting straight to what they're saying, because the framing that they use is always going to be stacked against us and we're never going to be able to win that fight. So we need to be able to take these frames and these phrases and these arguments and reestablish them into talking about, you know, everybody needs to be safe and we deserve that. So it's difficult to do, and I wish I had the magical answer on exactly how to do that, but that's at least my experience of what I've been experiencing in the UK, and I've been doing a lot of work on framing and messaging, and this seems to be something that is how best to approach it now. But of course, everything's constantly changing. So yeah, it's an ongoing thing, I think.
Yeah, I mean, in TGEU, we're also talking about this, how to combat this without engaging in an actual fight and actually risking of also hurting ourselves and burning ourselves. I think we have so much to lose in those conversations as trans people, because we enter those conversations with all of our experiences and our traumas, and someone can just step on them and say, you know, that's not right because you weren't born with a vagina. So I don't care if you know, experience this violence or whatever. And, you know, hurting ourselves like that is not the way to go when we're organizing. And we're also going to touch that topic. Ksen has looked into this topic, but maybe now then to like the legal consequences of this problem. We now know that Spain is a country in Europe where the government is actually presenting a new gender identity law, and the purpose for this is to protect the right to self-determination. And meanwhile, we're seeing how feminist groups or trans-hating women's groups are mobilizing against this bill. And here I would like to welcome you, Sabrina, to maybe walk us through a little bit shortly what's happening in Spain and what your reaction to what's happening in Spain right.
Yeah, I'm going to for all of you that maybe you don't know the current situation in Spain. I'm going to frame it. Since last year, January last year, we have a coalition government in Spain. Between it was being called like the most progressive government in Spain because it was the partners are the Socialist Party and Unidas Podemos, that is like in the orbit of the green left in Europe. That's basically the parliamentary group of Unidas Podemos. So of course, the tensions have been evident since the beginning because, of also the alpha males in both parties, basically. And of course, there has been this fight for power. And given that in Spain, the feminist movement has demonstrated 2 years or the years prior, all its strain with massive demonstrations, massive rallies, and also we have been, and also with massive conflicts as usual as sex workers. Basically, the trans issue was not that the rupturistic thing like 3 years ago yet. It was starting, but the main thing was also sex work. So also I personally as sex workers and trans people, we have been like involved in this environment of violence, basically, and that usually are the assemblies prior to for the preparation of the 8th of March. But it has been like very, very massive rallies. So of course, it's Socialist Party think that feminism in Spain it's theirs. It's their part of their patrimony. In fact, the vice president, the socialist, she said, no, like no, dear, like the feminists, it's socialist, like that. You can look for that. And of course, they are trying to trap that power of or that mobilization of the feminist movement. And of course, both of them are trying to get those votes and of course that influence. And the big fight has been the Ministry of Equality. So the Socialist Party had to give it out because they were giving the other ministries there for nothing, like the gambling thing or very small things. And of course, this was the big piece of cake that everybody wanted, and they had to give it to Podemos. Since the beginning has been the integral law, trans law in Spain. It has been redacted since I don't know 3-4 years ago. Maybe you remember, Jorge Maria. But we had a right-wing government by then. This government was taken out because of corruption, and of course it was taken out. And the trans law was around about to be discussed around those dates, and of course the government was taken out, so the trans law was put in a draw. And of course the Socialist Party has been addressing and supporting and presenting similar laws in the regional in different regions in Spain, like Madrid, like Catalonia, like Valencia. So the Socialist Party has supported the same thing that now is rejecting. So it's like that's the weirdest thing. So that's what it makes us see that it's a power move. It's like basically the trans people and trans people lives and trans people everyday lives has been putting in play. They're using like a volleyball in order to exchange power, and they are basically playing with our lives, because now with all this movement, they're also, of course, what we are saying, the right wing is trying is saying that, because even though the fascists are like plain encephalograms, the power understands that our struggles and our fights are intertwined. They cannot be one with another. And of course, it's Simone de Beauvoir already said that you need accomplices between the oppressed, so the oppressor couldn't be that, so the oppressor can't be that strong. So yeah, of course, it's again the same privileged white women that in the first first wave of feminism in the for the voting rights, they didn't want the black women to have voting rights. So it's the same women that are always trying to keep out of the rights to sex workers, because they prefer us to, they need us to save us, so they can get jobs and they can get grants and they can be at the UN and join with the CSW from the 1 to the 64, so they can decide on our lives. And of course, if I can share you one screen, one moment, we have like the great demonstration of this tweet and what happened on last Sunday in Spain. So,
yes, please go ahead. I mean, we have the technology, so why not?
Yeah. But I cannot share. I cannot.
Oh, you can't. Okay, we'll have to put it in the event or upload it somehow. But I want to.
Doesn't matter. Yeah. But I'm to describe it. It's the citizengO.org, or this right-wing association like anti-abortion, blah, blah. And here in Spain it's called Hazte oír, like make yourself hear, like more, even
make
more.
Make yourself heard, yeah.
Like yourself heard, like even more. And they've been traveling with this bus like some years ago, like a couple of years ago, boys have penis, women, girls have vaginas, blah, blah, blah. And abolitionists were and churches were protesting with, they have a big banner, like 6-meter banner, like sex is what the press is also, or something like that, And the boss of citizens.org, parked at the side, like they were very supporting of them, even though they tried to put the bus out because no, we're not like them. But it's a demonstration that they are supporting the same things, and yeah, it's a power move. The power, it's not relaxed with the power of the trans inclusive, some feminist inclusive movement has been gathering around, also with the racial movement. So of course, as Ugla said, they're trying to split that off. So that the strategy, of course, it's going back to the old values. I can have a theory about the UK thing now that Ugla said that. Look, of course, we know that UK had exported this Victorian Puritanism like everywhere it went. Also, feminism is a colonialistic import, because all this gender-based basis model, of course, it's a West imposition. And of course, that's how the colonialism works. So in this division of gender, so you can have to be there. The women that we understand, like the reproductive parts, has to be in a place, and the other part has to be, and it's how the system works. And we are also witnessing, like yesterday with the Meghan Markle thing about the racism thing, right? So that's how the British invented that. So
I'm very happy that you bring up colonialism. Actually,
they have to keep that. Yeah. So
yeah, because this is something actually. Yeah, it's something that we don't talk about actually when we talk about this problem, that it doesn't seem to be a problem in other parts of the world. It seems to be a problem in white majority countries. And I think it makes so much sense to just call out that idea of like the binary system. First of all, started with 500 years ago with the export or colonization of global South. And the way you determine whether people were civilized or not was if they were determinants for sex. So if men and women had different clothes, spoke differently, had different amounts of power. And this is the way that Europe actually exported this idea of like femininity. It's not like being just a woman, it's also being a white woman, like with blonde hair and blue eyes. And I think the aspect and dimension of race is very interesting in anti-fascism as well, since I do think that this is like allowing this hate or not combating it is also, as you're saying, opening the door, the gate for the fascists to bash us. So it's really interesting to talk about that racial dimension. I would like to continue maybe about to understand this problem, and more specifically talking about our internal movements. And I presented you, Ksen, as a researcher. You have studied particularly trans and non-binary social activists, most of them engaged in trans activism. And I would like to just ask you then, why do you think that we have this problem, and how would you say that we can overcome, when we have internal conflicts, as you could define this within feminism, or how we are to each other and create a culture of resilience in this time that requires so much from us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for your questions. I will remove the mask because my colleague has just left the office. So maybe to start first with how I understand this emerging phenomenon on anti-trans organizing within the feminist movement. My personal understanding, and I'm saying this as an activist, not as a researcher, because I haven't conducted research on TERF movements. I see it as a legacy. TERF, trans-exclusionary radical feminist organizing, I see it as a legacy of patriarchy, because in the patriarchal power system, women specifically are encouraged to compete with each other for validation, for visibility. So not to affirm, not to support each other, not to uplift each other, but to compete for the affirmation and attention of the men. So internalization of this narrative is actually what we are seeing now. It is a message, internalized message, that gets directed then towards trans movements, is that we cannot coexist. It has to be either me or you, because if it's us together, then you are going to take away the visibility of the work that we have done, the access to rights, to participation, to opportunities in society, and so on. So the way I understand it, it's a patriarchal narrative and it's a patriarchal legacy. The way I understand it as a person who is also a counselor in the training to become a group therapist is as a defense mechanism, which is in psychology known as identification with the aggressor. So sometimes some people, in order to navigate the aggressive environment, they identify with the narratives of the aggressor and perpetuate these narratives further. So this gatekeeping that we are seeing from trans-exclusionary radical feminists, this power they give to themselves to decide who can be considered a woman, who is worthwhile of visibility, and so on. It is actually, in my opinion, identification with the power position of the patriarchal system. Okay. And maybe now to move, because you asked me about the conflicts, the internal movement. So I'm specifically focusing on resilience experiences of trans and non-binary social justice activists from different European countries. So I'm interviewing people from the south, in the south of Europe, Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Northern Europe, and Western Europe. And I'm really interested to find patterns across these narratives of similarities and differences, of challenges that we face. Because when I started working with IGLYO a couple of years ago, we had this privilege, as Ugla knows, because we worked together. We were together in the board at the same time. We had this privilege that many trans and non-binary and queer people in general don't have. And this is to travel and meet queer and trans organizations and queer and trans activists. And the more I traveled and the more we met with each other, I realized there are patterns of shared experiences across the countries. Even though in the Balkans, the region that I come from, we sometimes activists say, oh, but people, trans activists from the Northern Europe, they cannot imagine what our struggle is. But if we actually have this opportunity to sit together in the same shared space, then we can actually witness each other's experiences and see that we are facing some common issues. So one of the common issues that I noticed in my research is this division within the movement, within the queer movement, within the trans movements. So the struggle, the power dynamic. So when we start working on intersectionality, what is bound to happen when we open the Pandora box of the power dynamics, of the privileges, what is bound to happen is uncomfortable discussions and uncomfortable feelings are gonna emerge, right? But the way I understand narratives of my participants is that we are not necessarily trained or we don't have educational opportunities in the formal system and also non-formal on how to navigate through these conversations, how to call out each other without shaming each other, how to hold each other accountable for our behavior and make our privileges visible and challenge them without shaming each other. And this is something, so how we communicate about power dynamics is actually what is determining, one of the determinants of the resilience within our own movement. But also, you asked us what can be done regarding this trans-exclusionary feminist organizing. So the way I'm understanding from the data that I'm working with, one area of work can be strengthening the movement, the trans movement and queer movements from within. So creating the culture of resilience instead of culture of shame and shaming each other. Another area of work is building alliances with allies, so that when we get very tired of repeating the same narratives all over again, the allies can actually take over and join, actually, not take over, sorry, join the struggle and continue educating. But for that to happen, we have to have the energy to hold the space for the learning process of our allies, because it can also be challenging if we are exposed to narratives of microaggressions all over again, coming also from sometimes well-intentioned allies, because sometimes people just don't know, they didn't have the opportunities to hear, to learn. In order for this to happen, I think I was really, before this research on resilience, I did a research on trans activist identity development with trans activists, again, from different European countries. And there are some specific support factors that activists told me they need so they can continue doing their activist work. Because on the one side, trans activism is very particular. On the one side, so it is people who are trans and non-binary who are engaged. So we have our own experiences of trauma, our own experiences of minority stress trauma that we bring in our activist work, but we also work on these issues specifically. So it's a double stress. We work on social oppression on a daily basis. So some of the things that the activists told me they interviewed, they need are the spaces to process experiences and emotions and power dynamics that exist within our own movement. The spaces to process and heal from minority stress trauma. Minority stress trauma just means that because of minority social identities, some people and groups are exposed to additional cumulative and continuous stress due to discrimination, violence, social exclusion, and so on. And please, Jorge Maria, you just give me a signal when I need to wrap up, because I lost a bit a sense of
No,
time.
but you can please do finish on like what trans activists needs, because I think this is a very important message for allies.
Yeah.
Are just, confused about situation. How can I in solidarity show up? How can I present the different kind of feminists? Please continue with that. I think it's very interesting.
Okay, so some of the support factors are the spaces to process our minority stress trauma that I said. And I have to say this, in the research has showed now that trauma is not only situational or developmental. So it's not only like adverse childhood experiences, but minority stress, it is a trauma. And the effects of this trauma, the effect on mental health, research proved that it's similar to the symptoms of PTSD, can be similar. So the good thing is that we are not doomed by our experiences of trauma, because in neuroscience, I just briefly have to say this, neuroscience has proved that if we are exposed to affirmative environments, supportive environments, in which we feel validated and welcomed and appreciated for who we are, our traumatized brain rewires itself. So it is not something that we are, how can I say, have to be labeled, live with forever in this sense. So what trans activists also told me they need is access to trans affirmative healthcare, of course, but also mental health care. So these spaces where we can actually process the burnout experiences and challenges that come with doing this activist work. And the role of IGLYO, this is actually the role of this wider community and environment, which can be a space of validation, support, affirmation of our existence. So this is, to come back to your last question about the culture of resilience. So I call the culture of resilience the opposite of the culture of shaming. So the rule, for example, in group therapy, there is a rule. Everything which happens in a society as a whole will replicate itself in every small group, in the microcosm. So if we live in the society where we have been shamed, and shame as an emotion means, guilt means I did something bad. Shame says I am bad. So if we are living in a microcosm, which is shaming us for who we are and sending us message, you shouldn't exist for who you are, it becomes very easy when we get triggered and upset and overwhelmed to replicate this pattern of shaming within our own movements, to shame each other. So the culture, the shame and resilience don't go together, because resilience requires, first of all, exposure, emotional exposure and vulnerability. So witnessing each other's experiences, validating each other's experiences without analyzing, labeling, putting guilt on each other and so on. So maybe before we focus on capacity building opportunities on how to communicate, maybe the first step would be to create these, let's say, sharing circles where we can just witness and validate each other. Learn how to self-regulate and how to co-regulate where triggering discussions are being opened. So to learn how to stay grounded, not to be reactive, not to go into the attack mode because we feel triggered and attack, right? This kind of a relational and learning environment is what activists are telling me they need. The last point that I would like to make is that if we focus more on creating this culture of resilience within our movement, then we have more energy left to hold the space for allies to support our movement. And recently there has been a consultation organized by the Council of Europe on applying intersectionality in youth work. I can share this because I was the rapporteur. I'm now writing the report about it. But youth organizations present, and I wish the TGEU was there to bring your own input, youth organizations that were present working with different minority youth shared that all of them face this issue, how we communicate without shaming each other, because none of us had these capacity building opportunities, how to deal with when we open the Pandora box of intersectional work. So practically, it would mean maybe that funders recognize that the trans movement and trans organizations really need to have for example, supervision opportunities where we don't just discuss strategic goals and objectives of activities, but we discuss the process, how we work with each other, what is happening in terms of power dynamics, in terms of emotions. So we have a space to process it. But if this type of work is not allowed within the budget that we receive, it's not possible to have this support system.
And here comes the cue then. I think it's so interesting what you've said. And I see, I mean, you're talking the same language, I would say, all of you, Ugla, when you're talking about, you know, not addressing or not fighting with your flesh, and Ksenia, when you're talking about, you know, well, we need to have these good conversations. I'm thinking about internalization, and someone started drilling in my apartment just because that's how some meetings can work. But we haven't spoken about, you know, the gender binary or like being non-binary and also not being a trans woman in this, because that's also an interesting topic that I would like to maybe explore a little bit. We don't have too much time. So when we hear these trans-exclusionary narratives, we very rarely hear about trans men. And if we hear about trans men, sometimes they're described as gender traitors, meaning that they're actually not men, but something else. And they're like, you know, traitors to the gender. I was also thinking about non-binary people that are almost never spoken about. And I know that there was a question here as well. Ugla, when you have said that you've find a way of finding like community, like I would say platform or way to speak between Trans Iceland and the Icelandic women group, could you tell me more about like how do you build bridges in that sense, and what is your take on non-binary and trans men in this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason why non-binary people and trans men are excluded from the conversation is because they reveal the hypocrisy of the whole conversation. And then they really shed a light on what's actually happening, because it's inconvenient to their argument. So they choose to ignore them, or they just dismiss them as gender traitors or confused lesbians, or whatever they wish to call them, which is quite funny, because trans people obviously have all sorts of sexual orientation. So it's quite interesting how they claim to be, you know, so open and not about gender, but then they always assume, you know, sexual orientation for trans people and all of these things, which is really heteronormative in so many ways. And it just kind of reveals exactly how fundamentalist they are. And that's why we never hear about them. And that's why they are always used whenever, one of the biggest things that they always use is that people are going to regret transitioning, and that's going to be the thing. And that's why they always have only people who are, you know, who maybe identified as a trans man or a trans masculine person who might have regretted it. These people always become their point of thing, because, you know, they can't use them in the trans conversation, so they use them in the ones that regret it. And it's just they only use them in points where it's convenient. And I think because it does reveal the hypocrisy of it. But it's hard to say exactly how to insert these into the conversation, because usually when I've said, or other people have said, well, actually, you know, non-binary people also exist in this conversation, their response is always, well, everybody can be non-binary. It's just a, you know, it's just a thing you say, and then they don't see it as an actual identity, and they don't see it as valid as being a man or a woman. So it's, you know, it's difficult to fight against it, and there's no clear way of how exactly to approach it, I think. But I think the more that we talk about it and the more we mention it, the more likely we are to sort of be able to identify it, because we need to point out those flaws and plot holes in their arguments, because then it sort of starts to fall apart. And that's what we do. I've kind of forgotten your original question now. So maybe...
No. So I wanted to know, like, the allyship between like the LGBT movement, where I suppose non-binary people also are welcome in Iceland, and also like women's groups or this alternative feminism or whatever we can call it, and how can we go about allying ourselves with the broad LGBTQI movement?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what's worked in Iceland in many ways is that we've always been quite of a small community, I think, and it's always been about, you know, how can we have the biggest impact as a community together, and what are those common grounds that we all have. You know, we are all different under the big umbrella that we have, and in Iceland that's been a big conversation about. I think it's a generational thing as well, because to me in Iceland, it seems that the people who often belong to the sort of older generation sometimes are more keen on keeping things a bit more separate. But I feel like the younger generation, and of course it's a bit of a generalization, but I feel like often the younger generations are more aware that we need to have that solidarity between us, because even within our small little groups, we're all very different. So I think, you know, you can have more in common with someone, even if you don't have the same sexual orientation or whatever, because we can also be people of color, we can also have disabilities, we can be all of these things, and we can connect with people on so many different levels. And I think that's been what's helped Iceland a lot, is that, you know, we've said, especially to the women's organization, we've said, well, trans people have been fighting for ages for, you know, against male violence, and we're fighting to be safe, and we're fighting for safe spaces, and safety is something we all want, and we can all create that together. So I think it's about identifying those particular areas and where we can find that solidarity and say, these are the places in which we all align. Of course, there's different things which, you know, doesn't always reflect or relate to us, but it's still all the same thing. And as immediately as you point out, well, the whole thing about this is the gender binary and gender expectations and oppression, you know, oppression related to gender and sex. And that's what it's all about: homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, racism, ableism, all of these things always relate back to that. So if we can manage to get people to realize that all of these systems belong to the same thing, we can realize, well, if we start to pick them apart, all of us together, all of us are gonna be liberated. And it's about liberation for everyone, I think. And that's a message I think has been rising a bit more in the UK as well, because in the UK we have a lot of phrases and slogans that we like to throw out, and as much as many of them are great, they aren't quite as impactful as we might think. So there's a really common phrase which I personally love, is when people say trans women are women, trans men are men, and non-binary people are, and then we're a bit unsure about what to say there. People say, you know, non-binary people are non-binary, and non-binary people are valid, and it kind of also reveals how these slogans, you know, they're absolutely true. There's everything true about it, but they don't have the impact that we think they might have, because it gives people a question. And when you say trans women are women, it gives them the opportunity to start questioning that and to start trying to deconstruct that. So for me, the message should be more about liberation, you know, liberation for all, trans liberation now. And it needs to be something that we can all relate to, rather than messages that can be pulled apart. And it's really hard to find those messages. And I'm not an expert in how to, you know, construct these messages and how to do it. But there, you know, we need to start thinking about things which are more common ground we can all relate to, and sort of pointing out the similarities of all of our oppression, because in my mind, it's all the same. When it comes down to it, it's all because of the very same factors. They just appear differently based on what specific group it is, but it's always the same tactic. It's always the same tools of oppression. And we just need to start pointing those out and finding that common ground. And that's what worked in Iceland with the feminist organizations here, pointing out those common grounds that we have.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And hearing what you, Sabrina, said, and you, Ksen, has also said, and also you, Ugla, I mean, we cannot destroy the oppressor's house with the oppressor's tools. So we have to find basically our own tools. And I take with me a lot what you've said, Ksenia, on resilience, on, you know, shaming versus guilt, or shame versus guilt. And also how to deal with conflicts. But I also take with me a lot from what you've said, Ugla, about building bridges with feminist organizations, feminist groups, women's groups. We didn't have too much time to talk about sex workers, in the sense that they're also very much affected by this conversation, and they're not always addressed, but just usually as trans people. But this is a topic that we have to digest even more, I think, because there could be even more risk factors for violence. on that topic. And we didn't also speak about, how also women are being invisibilized in this conversation, trans women, but also queer women, and how this, topic seems to hurt not only trans people, but all of us, basically. I'm not going to go into much, maybe into summarizing this conversation, because we don't have any more time left. And we are very thankful that you joined our panel today. So I'm going to use that time to thank you for sharing your knowledge and your experience, and also recognizing that this is a difficult conversation. I mean, I'm smiling right now because I'm excited about this conversation, but it's also very heavy, and it's a burden to take the higher lane, or be that bigger person, because in society we're not that bigger person. We're not seen as welcomed or appreciated. But to say, we have recorded this conversation if you'd like to follow it later or see it later. Very thankful again for your contribution, and I send all of my, how do you say it, good luck to you, Sabrina, and to the government of Spain, because I know what it's like having a government fighting for trans rights and then just 10 seconds later closing the door. And I know that this is a very important fight, and a lot of people are fighting together with you. So I am sending you all of my solidarity, to you as well, Ksen, and to Ugla. And thank you very much for joining us in this conversation. Hopefully we will be able to extend it somehow and keep talking about the topics we didn't cover today. Stay queer.
Always. Never straight.
Goodbye.
Bye.